close it out. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to DataCon. This is our 2021 event, and we're so happy to be here virtually. Looking forward to being back live next year. This is a panel on Show Don't Tell, How Data is Changing Hollywood. And we have 5 speakers for you. Alex Freund, the Senior Strategist of Content and Planning at Amazon Studios. Chris Detert, Chief Communications Officer at Influential. Michael Lofaso, who I assume will be visible when I leave the screen. And do let me know if that doesn't happen. COO of Rideback Entertainment. Laura Schaeffer, Head of Business and Strategy and Business Operations at Hulu. And then Eric Wilker of Wilker Media. So I will now exit. I'll be watching the Q&A. And I'll see you all again at the end. Thank you very much for being here today, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And let's also keep an eye, make sure Michael pops onto the screen here. But for everyone who's joining us, just thank you for taking the time to come join our panel. We'll be keeping an eye on Q&A the whole time, and we'll try to weave in questions throughout that pop up, but also we will leave time for 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. And that said, let's get into it. So the purpose of this panel is to really speak to the trend of there's more content, more streaming services, more UGC, and more social platforms than ever before, which leads us to a place of having to really be smart about how we convince people to spend their time engaging with the content that each of our respective businesses puts out into the market. So that's kind of the tee up for the panel. We've got an amazing group here with expertise across a variety of dimensions, including direct-to-consumer streaming, finance and marketing at a traditional studio. We've got somebody in Chris who focuses heavily on the social, digital, and influencer space. And then we've got Michael Lofaso on the more creative and operational side of generating actual content. So that said, I think what I'll do first is turn it over to do kind of a round robin. And so each of these panelists can introduce themselves, say a little bit more about not only where they work right now, but also their careers and how they got to where they are, which should broaden the aperture of the things that we're able to discuss and help you guys as the audience kind of understand their point of view. And then once we have a better understanding of exactly who all of these folks are, we will jump right into some of the meaty topic areas we plan to cover. So I think just because you're top left of my screen, Laura, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off, we'll go around robin.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. As Nancy said, I lead Hulu's strategy and business operations group for Disney, have been in the role for about a year, so joined mid-pandemic. Before that, I have a background in management consultant. So I spent the last 4 years before that with McKinsey's media and entertainment practice here in LA. But originally have come from the content creation side. So I have a degree in film production and was an entrepreneur for many years, having my own production company before all that. So have gained experience in the media industry from a lot of different angles, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk about how data has played a role in all these various aspects of my career, as well as how it will shape the work going forward.
Thanks, Laura. Eric, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for being here. I've spent the last 15 years at Warner Media, Warner Brothers in a variety of roles. Probably most germane to this conversation, I led operations and strategy for the worldwide television marketing unit, and worked with Alex on corporate synergy, leveraging the media assets for AT&T as part of the combination of those companies. And currently, I have an advisory practice in the TMT sector called Wilker Media Group.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Chris, why don't you go next?
Sure. I'm Chris Detert. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at Influential. We are the world's biggest and leading influencer marketing company. We represent about 60% of the Fortune 500, and we have transacted over $2 billion in sales as a result of our work. Previous to starting Influential, I started out in the mailroom of the firm, the biggest entertainment management company of the early 2000s. From there, I became the CMO of the fashion brand. You guys probably all remember the trucker hat from Von Dutch. So I did that until about 2005, and then started my own entertainment marketing and PR company called American Rebel PR, which I did until about 2013. And then my brother and I joined up 2013, 2014, and we started Influential.
Fantastic. And Michael, why don't you round us out?
Great. Thanks, Alex. And thanks, everyone, for being here. Currently, I'm the COO of Rideback. We produce TV and film across a variety of genres and formats. Most recently, we produced movies like The Two Popes on Netflix and Aladdin for Disney. Before that, I started two companies. One was a software company that was a health and wellness marketplace, and also a headhunting and recruiting firm in the software engineering space. Prior to that, I started my career in investment banking and private equity, first at Morgan Stanley and then a company called Riverstone, before making my way into the investing and then media and entertainment space. So it's great to be here with you all.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for doing that introduction. I think hopefully what those of you who are joining this panel have taken away from the panelists here is that we've got a really fantastic group of subject matter experts across the entertainment ecosystem with a very diverse set of backgrounds and experiences. And hopefully they're able to, shed light on a number of topics that are interesting to you guys. But we'll keep an eye on the Q&A in case there are things that you think should be addressed. And we'll either weave those in throughout, or we will pull them forward at the end during the Q&A session. And with that, I think where it makes sense for all of us to start is probably with the creative element of our industry. I think all of you guys are probably pulling in signals from a number of sources that provide data from which you can derive insights to make great decisions for your business, whether it's direct to consumer streaming or it's production or it's marketing or it's, social, digital, and influential. So I guess I'll start by just asking you guys, how do you think about the role that data plays in creative, whether it's the actual creation of the content or it's working with talent or partners to create things that have resonance with audiences and ultimately drive impact for your businesses?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there if helpful. I think for us, it's an interesting process at the, think of it as the seed stage of an idea that, we hope to turn into a piece of content. As producers in a production company, we often have this kind of intersection between what we think of as the business and the creative side for a piece of content. And we often try to use data to inform, whether or not we think content can be commercially viable from our perspective, because ultimately, to be long-term sustainable and successful, we need the content to be viewed by, wide audiences and hopefully to make money for our studio partners. So with that, a lot of times we think about IP or intellectual property that's behind a piece of content, to think about what's the audience sizing of that, what target demographics does it fall in, and kind of what type of engagement and fan resonance in the zeitgeist does it have. So we'll look for kind of signals around that, whether that's kind of understanding what its presence is on social media, how much is it kind of talked about online or in other forums. And then from there, we'll often try to partner with creatives who really lead the vision of the storytelling. So that's figuring out who's the right writer and sometimes director to carry a story forward. And oftentimes they'll also bring us potential projects. And there we kind of, we leave it in their smart, capable hands to drive forward a vision around what it is that they want to create. And this is where we get into a little bit of blend of call it the art and the science of the content. But kind of constantly throughout that process, as we kind of work with that writer or director or creator, filmmaker through their idea, our role is to help kind of shaping process of it to make sure that the data that informs whether or not it has a shot at being ultimately packaged and sold to a distributor, and then from the distributing standpoint, put out in front of an audience that will be well received. We try to keep things in a manner that is informed by data.
I would kind of tag onto that exactly, because from the distribution side, I think in many ways it's kind of a flywheel, right? Because we're trying to find content for our audience, but we're also trying to find audience for the content that we get, right, from our content partners. And so in many ways it's starting with kind of creating guidelines of what we think our audience is or should be or could be in the future, and what kind of type of content would be applicable to that audience, but then kind of feedbacking that to the creative team and the production team. But then on the other hand, also kind of listening to what comes from the production side and making sure that we do our audience segmentation and our audience targeting in a way that we find the right audiences for the content, right? So it's in many ways, it's kind of a circle, and data plays a role in a lot of these touch points.
I think those are great points, and I'll connect it too. Like from a studio perspective, you're managing a portfolio of content across a number of different distribution points and different audiences at different places. And I think it's really important from an economic perspective. What the data is trying to do is de-risk the investment that you have, because as Michael said, there is this art part of this, and then there's a science part of it. And so what you're trying to do is prove that there is a resonance with an audience in a particular genre or area or a place that you want to be. Where do you have opportunities? Where is that white space where there may not be stories that are told, but there is clearly appetite there? And then where are those opportunities where these are surefire bets? So as you manage this portfolio of content, these signals and the data that you get from a variety of different sources allow you to connect on Michael's side what content is being developed to the actual end streaming site, for example, on Laura with Hulu, where they are actually that last mile. Do you know enough about that audience? Can you connect to that audience? How does that portfolio play across the ecosystem?
And I'll follow up sort of from I think we had a prep call the other day, and I'm sort of the disparate element of this. You guys are very studio centric. So I think I'll typically come in at the end and kind of just give you the influencer marketing perspective on it. So for us, interestingly enough, our content creation is almost solely done by the influencers. So then for us, the responsibility of having data back that up works as such. So we look for influencers to create content based upon a couple of different factors: demographics, contextual relevancy, and psychographics. In 2016, we partnered with IBM Watson to utilize their AI. And through their algorithms, we're actually able to find out people psychographically, how people match up to a brand. Are they creative? Are they altruistic? Are they hedonistic? Are they adventure seeking? We're able to use everything that they've put out on the history of social, read all of the posts that they've ever put out, and from that extrapolate that into personality characteristics and index it on a scale of 1 to 100 of how well they fit a brand. So once we figure out how well they fit the brand, we give the brand the option to choose out of maybe a pool of 20, choose 10 of them. Then from that point, it's their task at that point to create the content. And by using the data to get us to that point, we give ourselves the best chance to have the best creative based on the data.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you for those insights. I think, sitting in the Amazon ecosystem as it relates to video and entertainment more generally, right? Like we think about all the things that you guys just mentioned and really try to hone in on some of those metrics that matter, whether it's balancing the cost per hour to acquire programming and then develop it and ultimately distribute it, or it's the hours projections that we think we're going to get and, what we think the lift to the service as a whole is going to be. And I think, by combining all of the pieces and elements that all of you guys talked about, including Chris, the talent that we work with and how much creative flexibility we give them to drive kind of the objectives for our service. I think all of those pieces really come into play. So thank you guys for shedding some light on that. I think based on everything you guys just shared, it might be interesting to just talk about where tension arises in thinking about the creative process and being very data driven in terms of your approach. So I guess I'd like to kick that one to the group. And I know it's something we deal with, all the time, but wondering how you guys reconcile that, where you think there are gaps, and maybe where you have actually seen that it's great to find creative partners who are also data driven. Just curious if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I feel like it's obviously those are two sides of one coin. Like for me, coming from the strategic side, it's data is involved in all of the strategies that we create, but it is hard to come up and formulate a strategy purely off of data. I think in many cases for us, it's kind of a scenario modeling situation where without some sort of strategic vision or creative vision or kind of direction that you want to go in, it is kind of hard to utilize data as your sole point in creating those strategies. So I think the two have to come together, and there is actually less tension, I think, than one might think, at least from my perspective. It's obviously in many ways content creation is an art, not a science. But I think there's many ways in which the two can come together and can create strategies that make sense. It's very high level, but
yeah, I would tag on to what Laura said. I think it's interesting. I mean, we are still gnawing at a world where we're able to have, natural language processing and AI write a story for us. I mean, there's GPT-3. There's a whole number of, very, very smart scientists out there trying to say, tell me a story about, and then have a computer write it. But what we found is that what resonates with audiences is still that intangible human touch. However, identifying areas of opportunity based on audience data and segmentation, as Chris was talking about, that provides us with the foundation to at least say, yes, we think there's an opportunity to try and develop here. Maybe it increases our hit ratio. But then you move further down, the chain, and you start to be able to use data in very, very practical ways in terms of awareness for audiences, earned, paid, and owned media opportunities, ancillary businesses that may exist around that. How do you pull in advertisers? It becomes a fairly rich world to live in, where the data that you derive from the stories that you tell in the audiences that you engage with become a flywheel, as Laura said, or an ecosystem that you're able to participate into, and to bring it to Amazon to be able to provide that value for the customer. Because ultimately, if you're not listening to the data appropriately and returning back to the customer something, or the audience, that is of value to them, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's interesting too, and I know from kind of our vantage point, as a production company and putting pieces of content together, it's always fascinating for us to, when something ends up getting distributed, we're always, curious, and there's probably some, asymmetric information as far as what the distributor, an Amazon or a Netflix might know in terms of their viewership versus what we know on the kind of call it the content creator side of things. And it just the level of granularity of insights that can be shed on a piece of content. You take a TV show, for example, and just the cover art that they might use in one country, showing somebody's face versus the cover art in another country, maybe showing a key geography or landmark that's in the particular TV show or movie. That actually might drive viewership one way or another, just based on what geographic preferences people have in that region and are more inclined to click on. And for us, that's always fascinating, because we have to try to think about how do we glue that together with the early stages of what a piece of content might ultimately become, or what it could look like. Knowing full well that once it ends up being distributed and marketed, there's a whole nother layer of analysis and segmentation that occurs, and it's not the same, as think about it as a product release, where at least for a movie, there's not exactly that iterative feedback cycle. Once it's out in the world, it's kind of out there, right? So there's not the equivalent of a software update to tweak and refine based on what feedback and signals that you're getting. So it makes it kind of interesting, and you hope that you can connect the dots to have something that'll be well viewed and well received. But it's part of the tricky part of things.
For us, we always say that data and AI isn't the be all end all. It's the mix of man and machine, or person and machine, that really provides the best results. And sort of going back to what I had said before, when we present to a client the potential creatives, the potential artists that we're going to be working with, we present them, all people that are highly qualified for it, but we give them a hand-picked selection in the process. Like if there's 20 of them we offer, say pick 10. And the idea behind that is that despite whatever, inferences and signals that data can provide, there is still a human element to creativity, and especially putting through the lens of a brand. If Johnson & Johnson is the client, they have a vision in their mind of what that Johnson & Johnson creator may look like or act like, or what their disposition is like. So we equally lean into human intuition and use the data as sort of a guiding light, or a North Star, if you will.
Yeah, that's fantastic, guys. I think I'm aligned on everything that's been said, and I think it really opens up an interesting set of possibilities as far as how you think about the creative and the data-driven processes coming together. And as social media platforms proliferate and new ones are launched, as streaming services emerge in the ecosystem with different business models, the question about how they thread the needle or weave those things together in a way that ultimately drives growth for their service is really the be all and all. So appreciate you guys speaking to that. I do also want to acknowledge we will have a Q&A portion at the end, but Derek has dropped into the Q&A, I think, a really interesting question that speaks to kind of where we were going to go next within this panel, which is, has new access to data given you insight into audiences that might be missing from existing distribution channels? It sounds like he's saying, for example, people who cannot easily go to a theater or need subtitled content. So I think before I kick it to our group, I think that's a really interesting question. It speaks to product, it speaks to marketing, it speaks to distribution. And I think, at a high level, what comes to mind for me, sitting in the SVOD, AVOD space are things like dubbing, local language programming, making sure that you're streaming direct-to-consumer options that have strong selection and content quality within them. So, I think it's certainly something that's been improving in the industry, and, rightly so and importantly. And in fact, I would go so far as to say it's probably a key area for differentiation and growth across all of our businesses to think about these things. But I'll kick it off to the panel to weigh in from their points of view.
I mean, I can jump in here.
Go ahead, Chris. Yeah, go ahead.
Chris.
Okay. I was just going to say from a social standpoint, I don't have a ton to say on this, but from a social standpoint, you've probably noticed over the last couple of years that you've seen a lot more of there being subtitles in influencer content. And that is largely because sound on is such a critical feature. And a lot of content was being missed because people would just look at it at face value, would not be interested enough to hear the content by tapping into it. And so they'd pass the content. So what we really started doing was making sure that there was text at the bottom of it so that people could read, could invest in the content right off the bat, because they might end up tapping in and listening to the audio afterwards, but it's sort of like the breadcrumbs that trail you to, engage in the content. So that's been something that we've done in our industry.
Yeah, I would say that underserved audiences is always a top of mind question for distributors and studios and anyone serving an audience to try and identify something they may have missed. In terms of the specific example that was brought up, I don't have any exact anecdote to tell, other than we noticed pretty early on, because we dub and subtitle. At Warner, we were dubbing and subtitling in 125 different countries, and we were noticing that a lot of the content was being pirated and quickly dubbed and subtitled in languages and then distributed in a variety of different places. So we saw that there was an audience who had a huge appetite for the content we were creating, but our speed to market was too slow for them given our process. So we had to create a new process to get that content in front of them. They would rather watch the content that we had in the best quality possible, but we're so desperate to see it that they would see it wherever they could get it. And so what we did was, in some cases, in places where we didn't have capabilities to dub and subtitle, we crowdsourced the dubbing and subtitling so that we were able to get that speed to market. So the data showed us that we were we had an opportunity there, and it was a really unique workflow that we had to create across a number of different territories to be able to shorten that process, that window that was not contractual for us, but was literally a process around dubbing and subtitling.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I think, as part of, at least in the theatrical film business, there's still a reasonable gap that, at least I'm optimistic that over time will get figured out, in terms of there's kind of two different types of viewing experiences, that are, have been around for a while. One is this kind of in a theater communal viewing process versus in your living room watching something, as an individual or as a small group, and kind of how data informs is one more viable or better than the other for a piece of content. I'll tell you, I hope that data can kind of continue to inform both of those, and particularly on the theatrical side of when we're testing a piece of content. Usually the way it works is we'll have a cut of a movie that, that's to be released, and at different parts of the editing process, we'll share it with an audience. And there's really something to be said about, just kind of hearing when people are laughing at the jokes together, or what the reaction on the scares might be. But as far as a kind of systems and process driven thing, in some ways it's still a bit of an old school data capture, right? At the end of the screening, people will fill out surveys, some qualitative, some quantitative, and that'll allow us to, essentially test how the movie scores at that particular part of the editing process. And if it scores, consistently high, maybe we're feeling good about things. If it's scoring low, we'll still have time in the editing process to try to improve things. But what I think is always fascinating is, like anything, sometimes you have outliers. And to your question about, as we think about, global audiences and, trying to map towards demographic, sometimes you'll just find that as much as you try, if you're doing a handful of test screenings at theaters, across Los Angeles, you're probably just not going to hit everybody who you might intend or want to see that movie. And sometimes you have great surprises to the upside, and you can kind of track that on Rotten Tomatoes or other signals to tell you, what both critics are thinking about it, and then people who, audiences who have seen the movie are thinking about it. And sometimes you have unfortunate surprises to the downside, where you test great and you think it's really going to land, and for whatever reason, whether it just didn't resonate at scale, or it came out at a time when, the marketing campaign, didn't map right, or if the content just kind of fell flat for whatever reason it could be, that happens too. So it's a little bit of a juggle for us, and I think figuring out how data can kind of continuously improve things right up until the release is important, because the lead time between getting a movie together versus actually it ends up in front of an audience, it could be several years. So a cultural theme that, we think could be interesting right now or today, or maybe even in a year or two, if the movie doesn't release in 3 or 4 years and we miss the market, it's a tricky thing. So it's definitely a constant balance of trying to read the tea leaves and where things are headed.
And to follow on to that quickly, the social signals become very important, which is why many of the studios have a large presence at each of the major con events that exist, such as a Comic-Con, New York and LA, or any of the other specialty areas, because they'll drop a trailer, even though the film may not be complete, they'll drop a trailer to get a sense of what the social signals are that come in, to get a sense of what's resonating with audiences and not, and where it's resonating. So, in this case, more data is better than less, and understanding at an early stage, what the velocity and tracking is of something like that is critical to the success of both the marketing and the film itself.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe a little bit out of context, but on our side then, since I'm coming in later in the value chain, but once we have a piece of content, when it originally launches on our platform, there is a very human element of kind of targeting and thinking which audiences might be interested. And to be honest, we usually err on the side of like making targeting a little bit bigger. And then once our machine learning algorithm kind of kicks in and takes over, right? They learn and they see from the audience behavior, like which audience does it skew towards. And that process, I would say, is usually about 10 days in. But even like 1 or 2 days after launch, right? You get a relatively good picture of kind of which direction it tends. And at that point, and I know, Alex, you had, thought about like kind of what role postmortems play in the data as well. Like it is relatively fast, right? Because you can like 1 day in, 5 days in, whatever, you can with pretty good detail kind of picture the audiences that are viewing a particular piece of content, and then on the portfolio level kind of bring that together and either by content partner or by the general portfolio pick, kind of create a map of which audiences correlate with which content type, and then go from there.
Yeah, and it's kind of fascinating too, because like right now, coming out of of COVID and how that's changed the theatrical business, we're actually kind of seeing some really fascinating case studies where I think data plays an important role. So even not a movie that we worked on, but it's kind of fun to watch this unfold in real time. You look at a title like the sequel to Top Gun, which is a Paramount studio project. In the news recently, you see a kind of an interesting back and forth where IMAX is urging Paramount not to move the date of the release because obviously they think it's a great title. They want it to drive business and bring people out to the theaters. And then Paramount on the other side, they want to wait until, all the data that they're getting from who's going to the theaters, what are comfort levels from people about visiting, unfortunately with, some of the spikes around Delta. They're trying to read all those signals to release the movie in an environment where they think they can optimize the audience that they reach with it. And I think Paramount too, of all of this, part of their, in their back pocket, I think they think kind of creatively and emotionally, they have a really compelling, great movie to release, and they want to wait until the timing is perfect for it, which is why they want to optimize it and maybe not, put it on a streamer. They think it's made and will do well with a mass, theatrically released product. So it's kind of them doing a little bit of a gut check on, and Eric, you mentioned this earlier, that how do you weigh the economic elements of it? There's talent relationships around it, right? I'm sure Tom Cruise, who stars in it, is he's steadfast in wanting it to kind of be on the big screen, and people have that very visceral experience of aviation. So the studio has to balance those relationships and decision factors as well, in terms of keeping both their stakeholders happy, their talent relationships happy, and ultimately their consumers happy. So it's a lot of things to juggle.
Yeah, that's great, Derek. I hope that at least begins to kind of address some of the topics you were trying to dig out in your question. I think, we heard about how Chris is using real-time data that's driving an insight that, we need to have captioning in our social posts, which, was probably an innovation at the time Chris and team launched it. I think from Eric, we heard a lot about the importance of underserved audiences and some of the tripwires associated with trying to deliver on benefits of those audiences, including, are there erroneous actors who are jumping in and trying to take advantage of things like dubbing and then pirating illegally. I think it's a really fascinating challenge. It's got multiple prongs, and it is three-dimensional in terms of how studios and content companies address it. And then I think from Michael, we heard a lot about testing and the importance of testing and picking up signals over a long timeline as a project goes from conception to release, whether it's theatrical or other. And then Laura, pointed to the use of algorithmic signals on a streaming platform and the ways in which she and her engineers and content partners pick up those signals and make decisions about who should be better served with content. So I summarize only to say, Derek, I hope that covered what you were looking for. And if not, please drop another question in there and I'll make sure to try to pick it up along the way. But I think overall that puts us in a really interesting place because we've started to talk about not only the creative process, but also product functionality. And so I wanted to toss out to this group of experts, what are some of those functionalities that data suggests either need to emerge or need to be more fully developed? And, what is the timeline like for those things kind of happening? I think maybe an example to ground us in is I think Netflix does a really good job of A/B testing their thumbnails and their creative visually on the platform and trying to understand what kinds of things resonate with their customers at the individual level. But what are some other examples of things that whether it's streaming services or others from a product perspective? I know, Chris, you'll probably have a very unique perspective on this from the social side. That some of these services can do to better deliver against, audience demand and creative imperative.
I could jump in real quick. I mean, I think, from a streaming service standpoint, we essentially ported over an old model of advertising to a new way of distributing. And I think, there needs to be a better experience for audiences when it comes to interacting with ads on ad-supported platforms. And I know we all talk about it in the industry as something that is really important to us, but we still have not yet, Hulu did it early on with the choose your own ad, but since then we really haven't advanced the ball tremendously using the data that we have around how audiences would prefer to interact with ad content on platform. Now, Chris, on the other hand, probably has more experience in terms of off-platform, how that has evolved much more rapidly. But I think there needs to be a convergence of the two, where the ad experience is much better, more entertaining on platform, and could learn something from, the influencer economy.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that our business is essentially all ads, like nothing but ads. But the challenge that we have and the challenge that we have to overcome is making that content so entertaining that when you see, because you have to put hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored. A lot of times now you'll see the content actually in the headline will say paid partnership with. So the audience is knowing right off the bat that they're being served an ad. And typically the visceral reaction to being served an ad is, I don't want to see this. But if you do it so well and it's so entertaining and it's done to the right audience by the right creator, then it almost doesn't feel like advertising, and then the message is still well received.
Yeah, I know, Laura, anything from your point of view, given that you're an ad-supported platform, not to put you on the spot, but is that an area of interest for you, or are there other things that you think streamers should be more focused on?
I think the reason I'm so quiet is because there's so much. From the ad product side, for sure. And it is, Eric, as you mentioned, Hulu has always invested a lot in our ad product and our ad product development, because it is such a big part of what we do, and it has been around for quite some time. So we're continuing to investigate what we can do in the space, for sure. I think there's a lot of, you mentioned Netflix. I think what comes top of mind for me is that in this space, it requires, Eric, you talked about speed to market, and I think for feature development specifically, what I see is that there is, for like the big traditional media companies that now have kind of the direct to consumer component, it's just a different speed we're talking about here, because I feel like there's a need to develop things just simply much faster. So instead of talking about, for me, like which features we want, it's more that I think what needs to happen more generally is to increase the speed to at least testing. And I think that now brings us into a whole different discussion about talent or like product and engineering talent and how that shifts in the industry. But in general, that's kind of, for me, top of mind when I think about product features, because there's literally it changes every day, and there's kind of new ideas and new tests being done, or that should be done in relative high frequency. So.
Yeah, and I thought it was kind of interesting, just connecting a little bit of, Chris, what you were saying, and Laura, what you're saying, at least from the creative standpoint. And maybe this is less of a product feature and more of like, how do we think we can insert content within the evolving kind of way that products are distributed or audiences are engaged. A favorite of mine is a TV show, Ted Lasso, right now. And I think to the origins of like, where did that come from? Well, it started off as a branded content commercial for NBC Sports that was just kind of a viral video on YouTube, and gained traction. And at that point, right, you're thinking of how are people engaging with that? Well, it's almost the most kind of pure form of advertising, right? It was literally an ad for NBC Sports, but the characters and the quality of it was so good that people loved watching it. And it kind of grew into a life of its own, right? So the characters kind of, made it feel like they weren't selling something. They were just something that people wanted to watch. And you fast forward, and again, maybe at least today, this, it's not like this happens, with every ad you see, but, in circumstances when it's really well done, you think about that crossover to what we think of as, traditional TV and film. So now on Apple, right, it's probably still to the benefit of NBC Sports and English Premier League. It's part of that conversation, but it's also nominated for over 20 Emmys. So it's something that broke through the noise to be just such a high quality content level that regardless of how people are being served that content, they're excited about it. So I just think it's cool that, a cool way that, if you can tie strong content with product features and the right ad model and all these different factors, you can still create something that people want to engage with.
I'll give a shout out to the Warner Brothers Television crew, because that is one of their shows. And Chris, just real quick, I think, we can come back to this if you want, but, I think I'm going to wade into the M&A side of this, and we're talking about product features and development and engineering talent and what we can do. We realized pretty quickly at Warner and Warner Media that big companies, to Laura's point, have a very hard time innovating at the speed that's required to get something to market. So we developed a program to bring in entrepreneurs who had complementary products that could work with our existing products in some way, to try out these features and test them in a much faster way and pivot them into ways that could help both us and the companies we brought in. We found it was just impossible to be able to do it just wholly homegrown internally into the company. So we built a program and a process around that deal flow, which brought in all of these really interesting entrepreneurs with wild ideas, some of which worked, many of which didn't, but they gave us lots of data back and insights around the audience, as well as got us much farther ahead in terms of product development than we'd be if we were just trying to do it on our own. There are lots of considerations around that, as we could talk about, what do we need to own versus what can we buy or partner with. But I just thought it was important to kind of wrap that up in that point, that product features are extremely difficult to do quickly. So we leveraged the existing, companies that exist out there. And I thought for those listening to this, that's a real area of opportunity for entrepreneurs. How can you build complementary services that can help studios with what they're struggling with and distributors?
The point that I was going to add was, interestingly enough, early next week, we have a major announcement. You guys have probably seen this a bit for the last few years in both television and film, but in post, superimposing products into the actual content. We're going to be the first company in the social space to ever do that. So we're making that announcement next week. And I think that really speaks to having inventory where you necessarily didn't always have it. It's sort of like an endless, you can actually go back into old content and add, add an ad unit into it. And it's obviously a much less direct, it's a more implied sort of ad unit, but it creates a brave new world for our industry, which is really exciting.
Congrats, that's great.
Thanks.
Yeah, big news. I know dynamically inserting branded or sponsored content within existing creative is something that is a trend that's emerging across our industry. So for those listening, I think keep your ear out for those kinds of things. And if you're on the hunt for, a data analytics type of role where that might be an area of interest, I think there's clearly a lot more to come. And congrats to Chris and team for getting a product out there on the social side. I think we have a question in the chat from Lucas. Lucas, I'll start with, actually we have two. I'll start with your second question, which is, are you using AI to mine for new ad space, i.e. scanning legacy content for opportunities for injection? I think if I'm interpreting that right, Lucas, you're referring more specifically to the virtual product placement or potentially contemplating a new ad unit within existing content. So perfect. So what Chris just mentioned, I see you responded to me. Thank you. Yeah, so Chris, maybe I'll let you take that and sort of speak to how you guys are thinking about positioning the product. I think Eric and I know for sure, probably Lauren, Michael, have some experience contemplating or building out products or functionality with virtual product insertion. I think it's, from what I know, it is less about AI doing the mining as it is about using data to create the right linkage between the right content and the right brand or sponsor to make it impactful. And then, we will look at metadata, not so much algorithmically, but we will look at within the metadata, where does it make the most sense to actually go and drop that in without being disruptive to viewers and changing the engagement pattern that's so important to the experience of viewing a piece of content. So I'll acknowledge that from my perspective. I think, Chris, you probably have a lot more since you're a lot closer to this in real time.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, first off, Lucas. Interestingly enough, and I'm not sure if you've been here this whole time, but we actually, through our AI partnership with IBM Watson, we have the ability to look back at the entire history of anything that influencers have put out on social. And in fact, even more so, we can do what they've actually taken away from their platform. So if in 2013 an influencer put a piece of content out there that they don't want people to see, they might think it's gone forever, but our algorithms can pick it up and our AI can pick it up. It's a little tangential to what you're asking, but in terms of what you're asking specifically, we are actually looking at legacy content for the influencers that we decide to use as, an inventory source. So if we're working with, I'll give you an example. We're working right now with Sharif O'Neal, who's Shaq's oldest son, star basketball player at LSU. We're going to go into his account and we're going to scan all of his legacy content and we're going to figure out data points that it picks up. Does he obviously he likes basketball, maybe he likes tacos or Taco Bell or whatever it is. And we'll find those pieces and then that will help to inform the creative, help to inform what insertions that we'll make from that, that post, putting in of content.
And Chris, just to address Lucas's question, are you contemplating in the future using IBM Watson or some sort of machine learning or algorithmic function to ultimately do that at broader scale as you guys roll that out and kind of grow it? Or is this more sort of human curated, since there's a lot of subjective, emotional touch that needs to be handled here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's funny with obviously I can't mention the name of the company till we make the announcement next week, but we had a conversation with them earlier this week, and I think there was sort of a mentality that this was all of a sudden just all automated. We're not even close to there yet. What we have to do is use the data and then make our best human inferences onto what makes sense here. But the hope is 2 or 3 years down the road from now, this could actually be like a self-serve automated platform that doesn't require any human touch, that it, the AI will be so sharp at that point. And all of you guys know this, especially I'm speaking to data people. AI is like a young child, you start with like white matter and like no knowledge. And the more that it learns, the smarter that it gets. So we're really pioneering something that's brand new. But the hope is that in a couple of years, it will be many steps beyond that.
And I'll just tag on to the end of that and saying that as the technology that's being developed that Chris talked about, and as the dynamic ad insertion and product placement, those integrations happen, the ad sales team is going to be pushing very hard for targeted addressable advertising via programmatic or something else, to be able to super serve those audiences and charge higher CPMs for those finely tuned audiences with the products that resonate with them most.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, thank you for that question, Lucas, and Chris in particular, for really taking us down the pipeline there of how you guys are thinking about it for your business. I think where this naturally leads me is to thinking about how we do marketing and how we think about audience acquisition in the entertainment space generally. And so I think one of the questions that perhaps ties a thread between what Lucas was asking and kind of some of the things we've been talking about as it relates to marketing and reaching audiences is, how can data help give audiences content that they don't even know they will love, but we think that they will based on signals that we pick up? And I know each of you kind of has a different way in which you reconcile that question depending on where you sit in the entertainment value chain. So I think it'd be interesting to hear from you guys on being able to anticipate and what signals you guys get that may be leading or lagging indicators that you use to inform the decisions you make about what you put in front of audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I can try to kick us off with an example of, in a lot of ways, as we think about that, it's a little bit of a risk assessment. And when we're trying to work with, creative partners and rights holders, who may not have, made a piece of content before, there's a lot of things to factor in. So one of the groups that we work with is the Lego group, the toy company. And, years back before our company had made a handful of movies with them, there's a question from them too, which is, we have a really successful toy business and a great kind of cherished, consumer set. Does it even make sense for us to, risk making a movie that could flop and damage our brand, right? So there's an assessment of, from their eyes, what's the risk reward of entering into the content space. And the way that we really approached them about that was, can we start authentic conversations with an audience that don't come across as selling them something, right? So I think the idea being, they're already a wildly successful, company. How do they engage their audience in a way that feels kind of organic to their brand and in kind of even just as a standalone piece of content, something that would be enjoyable. So that process was really informed by working, first off, learning really what their brand principles are. And then in that instance, it was kind of a blueprint that, we hadn't really done before, but it was, trying to come up with a surprising and enjoyable story and characters in original threads that they hadn't gotten to that territory yet. So I would say throughout that process, at a lot of stages, the leading indicators, there were certainly some, right? It's one of the world's most renowned brands for sure, and such a respected and trusted brand. But there wasn't the leading indicator of a clear delineation that a movie or content is an obvious answer to further build their brand. So for us, it was kind of each step along the way, getting both ourselves and all of our partners comfortable with this idea that whatever we could try to execute would hopefully be at the highest quality level, and that audiences would enjoy it.
Yeah, from our side, I mean, it comes back to our recommendation algorithm, right? A lot of the marketing is actually like surfacing the right content to the right audiences. We very heavily rely on data and on AIs to kind of help with that, right? Because as you mentioned, Alex, like metadata is a part of it, but also just kind of segmenting our subscribers into groups of people, and then observing what other people who are like you would be watching, and then recommending content based on that. So surfacing content that you might not have found by yourself or actively searched for, but that we believe would be a great match for you, just given what we know about you and what we know about people like you. So obviously, kind of that's a big part of what we do. But I think the big question for us is always, what can we do in addition to that? Because as we all know, kind of systems, even the best algorithms will, to Chris's point, like for a new subscriber, it's going to be very hard because there is a lot to learn, and it gets better over time. And also there is a certain amount of kind of human influencing that might or might not help find new audiences that the system would maybe not have immediately picked up on. And so that's, I think, a lot of our discussions are kind of, we have this basis that we believe works really well, but what can we do in addition to that for subscribers on the platform? For new subscribers, that's kind of a different story, because we obviously have way less data, and we would need to partner with third-party data to find out about new audiences and how we can target externally in our marketing. But that's kind of a separate story.
Yeah, and maybe just add to that too. It's like as we're thinking about going down that path, there's kind of two schools of thought, and I'm sure that you guys go back and forth on how to check both of these boxes. But from a data perspective, one parallel is obviously serving audiences the things that they want to see, and that they have hunger for. But then the other is, and we struggle and try to grapple with this all the time, is how do you come up with something that audiences want to see, but they don't even know they want to see it yet. And obviously dating ourselves a little bit here, but you think of like the origination of something like Star Wars, right? This epic kind of space odyssey, as you will, like those characters and ideas and things. Like I don't know that anyone was particularly asking for it at the time, but if someone hadn't taken that risk to have a vision for what they thought people might not know they want to see, but they'll love it when they see it, it's like probably a scary leap to take. But when it hits like that or anything even close to that, it must just be the most rewarding thing you could ever experience, because then that feedback loop of data becomes more more of an emphasis on proving out a thesis that may not have even had existed yet. So it's something we think a lot about.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was at such a rudimentary level data at that point. So George Lucas is taking a swing, and I mean they put a lot of money into this for back then, and I mean it could have been a colossal flop, and we could have never heard of him. And instead, you got George Lucas, the legend, who his IP is so valuable now that it's been integrated into rides at Disney and all that sort of stuff, and billions and billions of dollars later. Dovetailing off of that, also I would say you guys all know this. The social platforms are better than anybody at serving you things that you didn't know you wanted. So we lean into that for sure. And when we're trying to figure out what audiences to serve messaging to, we're always looking for relevant proxies. And then another thing that we're doing that our brands love, especially if you're talking about like, we're the AOR of McDonald's. McDonald's really wants to know, wants to conquest, wants to take customers from others. So we have the ability to, be able to look into other audiences that are going to those restaurants and then be able to serve them relevant content that can help drive them from, and we can do it by doing some sort of a promotion or couponing that drives the customer from the original place that they were going to our clients. So that's been a very valuable tool for us.
Yeah, and I've actually, so not with Hulu and Disney, but I've actually done that before to kind of create personas for audiences and then kind of put in those personas on social media platforms and kind of see what other things are they interested in aside from, what we know on our platform, because the platform data is obviously very limited. And then kind of look at overlapping interests, and that's maybe a little bit, Michael, what could offer you something more that we can see on the platform is to kind of find these external factors that could bring us back to what they might be interested in that we don't currently show, that it doesn't show on our platform, on our data. I think the balance is always, there's a certain risk for us in kind of overriding the personalization, right? Because if we're talking about offering people something that they might not know they will like, then it will always, we're talking about overriding what we would call the kind of personalization and the recommendation engine that we have, because what our recommendation engine is supposed to do is offer you the type of content that we know you will like. So when we're talking about offering you something that we don't know you will like, but we hope, it means kind of manually overriding that system. And there is a balance between, of course, we want to do that because there is always a Star Wars out there where we find audiences that we might not have known would be there before, but we also don't want to do that too often because then it would defeat the purpose of our very personalized system, right? So that's exactly kind of the balance that we're trying to surf on an everyday basis.
Yeah, there's a real challenge between, that personalization engine that you have when you're on platform and then attracting a new customer, conquesting a customer, as Chris said, off platform to sign up. And that is really interesting, two different kind of data sets and how you figure out how you're going to, how you're going to convert that customer, drive them through the funnel as quickly as possible, and then get them to that personalization as quickly as possible. And again, the social media signals that you get off those platforms, they've done a really great job at the personalization, but still, I think there's work to be done, as Laura said, that fine balance of what is it that, you expect and how do you give them something they didn't expect that they might enjoy. And that's very challenging.
Yeah, thank you guys for those really thoughtful answers. I heard a couple of things come through. One being segmentation and analysis, maybe even building personas around potential audience cohorts to address. And as you build those personas, you start to understand tastes and preferences and maybe where some areas of opportunity might be. I also heard, that there's an appetite probably to create adjacencies, content that would resonate based on the fact that other content has already resonated, maybe in the form of shoulder programming, maybe in the form of acquisition of licensed titles that are already out there to put on a platform. I think the other thing that, Chris, certainly this is your world, but I think all of us, the thing that came through that wasn't explicitly stated is how does this inform the acquisition and development and budgeting for original content, and what original bets do you go make to optimize, your hit ratio? So I don't know if any of you want to address that point more specifically, but if not, I think, that's what came through for me.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to say that on this kind of idea of like a hit ratio and a funnel, it's, I think of it, coming a little bit from the investing world prior to this, I do see some parallels, right? As we think about what stages, I guess the corollary would be, as we're, developing pieces of content, are we making enough kind of pre-seed and seed stage bets where every once in a while you might find innovation in content that, you might not find if you're kind of more just playing at the kind of already big IP, familiar things that people, might already point to. It's certainly, it's a harder portion of the funnel. It's harder to break through. Again, it kind of does come down sometimes to you have to be able to convince a studio and a distributor to also take that bet with you. And Chris, like you mentioned, a lot of money into a Star Wars or even another, Pixar is a great example of that. Just it did require a big J curve of funding to get it to, to the place that it is now. And in hindsight, we look at that and say, okay, yeah, now, when new movies come out, there's a quality bar and an association that goes with it. But oftentimes it's, can we take some risks with filmmakers or rights holders to try to find those, call it seed stage bets that are pockets of innovation. And, the reality with that is a lot of times there's plenty of failure that goes with it. Some, I would say most of them, consumer audiences don't hear about because they don't make it to the big screen. There's another segment that, you think is going to be that risk that might turn into the next franchise, and it actually makes it all the way through, call it to the IP. It flops therein, and then every now and then you have something that makes it all the way through and continues beyond that. So it's kind of a funnel that's, in some ways not too dissimilar from what you might think of in an investing world.
Yeah, that
reminds me of something we always say. We say that social media is the single greatest source of crowdsourcing of public information of all time. If you can learn to structure that information, you can predict the future. And I think that's probably the same for all of your industries as well.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Thank you, guys. I think that's really fantastic insight, especially as it relates to kind of the bets that you make on what content you produce. I think that takes us to an interesting area for exploration, which Lucas teed up earlier in his question around how long is it before Netflix and Amazon just start cherry picking select theaters to buy and sort of wholly own within their portfolio to kind of create that thread line all the way from content acquisition or development to distribution down the value chain. I think more broadly, that question really is about capital allocation. And so I'd love it if we could wrap that within a broader topic, which is how are you guys using data, or how do you think the industry at large is or should be using data to inform capital allocation decisions and the bets that we make, and how those bets ultimately will or will not drive meaningful impact to the business? Eric, I can put you on this.
I was going to jump in. I mean, we talked about this in our pre-session a little bit. I mean, I think, the reality is the least sexy part of this is operational efficiency, right? Understanding, how all of the activities that take place as you run your business impact your cost basis such that you're able to preserve capital to be able to invest it in the content, which ultimately drives your business forward. So how you determine, where that margin improvement can be and how you invest that additional percentage or 2 or 3 or 10, if you can get it, to drive your business forward is really, really important. These are legacy businesses, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are legacy businesses with a long history of challenging movie accounting and a long history of cross-purpose allocation of costs. And I think as Amazon and Netflix and social media companies push that speed and push these companies to have to figure out how to be better and how to really optimize where their staff is, where their efforts are, you'll start to see that allocation. You'll start to see that allocation change it, but you already are. You're seeing it with Warner Media pushing at HBO Max tremendously. You've seen it with the Hulu and Fox and Disney coming together. You're seeing it across the industry as these tech companies are forcing legacy processes and inefficiency to be wrung out through complex analysis using partners like an IBM or using partners like Accenture who are on this to try and figure out where those opportunities exist.
Yeah, I want to just lean into that a little more, Eric, and really sharpen the question to if Lucas is ultimately talking about owning distribution and the end-to-end value chain, whether you own it or not, I think what he's speaking to is the ability, or maybe he's not, but I think we should address the ability to have data from the audience, right? Direct to consumer data. And right now, in the theatrical business, by and large, there is breakage in that data because the exhibitors own the relationship with that customer.
Right. And it's so, first party, second party data, third party data. It's where do you need that to sit? Because the data is accessible if you're willing to pay for it. I mean, you know, studios spend a lot of money with Google. We did a lot with Merkle. Laura mentioned this before, where we built these audience profiles. We figure out where we need to allocate our funds, and we A/B test the hell out of 20 different pieces of creative to see which one resonates with those different personas. But we're paying for it. So the question of this is, again, capital allocation is where do you wish to place your bets, and what data is important to own is maybe really the key question.
From an influencer perspective, one of the things that I haven't touched on, that one of our main secret sauces that's really made us the top company in our industry is the amount of paid media that we're running. So doing an ad with an influencer is that's the first part of it. That's just doing the native content. That can only reach a certain part of the audience because the way that the social platforms are set up algorithmically, they're limiting the amount of content or the amount of viewability that someone can actually see. So us putting paid media behind any content, whitelisting behind an influencer's content, allows us to reach greater audiences. And with that, we have a live dashboard that our media team and our clients have the ability to constantly watch. And they can, on a dime, switch, from one, if somebody's performing very well with the paid media behind them, yet somebody else is not performing so well, we can reallocate that money. And our ability to turn on a dime and consistently move that money to make the most, the best decision from a capital allocation perspective usually allows us to have a lot of success, which typically gets our clients to actually want to double down and spend more money. They might have signed a deal with us to spend $300,000 on a campaign, and all of a sudden they're so happy with the results that it goes to $450,000. So there's a lot of dynamic ability to read the data and do what the data tells you for the best results.
I would also add, Eric, when it comes to if the question is what kind of data it makes sense to own, there's value. The video value chain is just one, right? What we're seeing increasingly happening with Netflix expanding into gaming, and there's several cross media, whether it is podcasts or other kind of branching out, or Disney has a very big consumer products business and a parks business, which also has data that you can or theoretically might want to use and combine with the data you have. So I am very curious to see what will happen, not only in this value chain, but in kind of across the entire kind of different media value chains, because it seems to me like there's a little bit of a convergence going on. And especially when you think about Amazon, I mean, there's so many different businesses that they can theoretically tap into to inform. So the question is it really is owning the physical theaters, is that the solution, or is the solution maybe somewhere else?
That's an excellent question and a good point. I mean, I don't think anybody has more data on consumers than Amazon at the moment. I'm sure they could ship me whatever I need tomorrow without me doing anything. But no, it's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Michael, I want to leave space for you as far as you think about capital allocation. I know you guys have some really innovative and interesting things that you do as a production company, whether it's creating platforms for partnerships with talent or companies, or it's incubating talent within the pipeline. And you guys have placed some bets there. It'd be really interesting, I think, to hear from you about that.
Yeah, fascinating just to Eric, Chris, and Laura here and hear you guys talk about that, because it gets the wheels turning for sure. I mean, for us on the, I guess think of it as the content supply chain or the content pipeline. We try to think of ways where there's call it and this is changing, but call it the traditional pipeline of content, right? Something enters the funnel, you try to find a writer, or a writer brings you something that they want to put together. It goes through, usually it's them, at least for the early stages, working on something themselves. I wouldn't say in a vacuum, but it's by and large, in a lot of ways, it's a kind of an individualized process. One of the things that we try to do is how do we make the content creation process more collaborative? Bringing in mentors or experts in certain areas of subject matter to help a filmmaker have as many resources as they possibly can to tell their story. I think our hope, in allocating capital towards those infrastructure and systems and processes is that, you'll end up with things that are a little bit different or may not have occurred kind of as we think of like the traditional pipeline, content creation pipeline. A good example of that is, one thing we like to do is, we have you call it a brain trust of filmmakers, where one writer in the group will, they'll come to us with a project that they need help on. It might be a project that they're just writing the script for, or it might be a project that's already been, shot and gone through a round of editing. Could be at any stage. And, they'll bring it to us, and then we'll kind of bring in this brain trust of other filmmakers to help them kind of tackle whatever issues that they're having at that time. And through that kind of collaboration, sometimes there's, unexpected, things that you might learn from it. And maybe some of that's even just the relational element of when another director tells one director something, they might receive that feedback loop differently than if, a producer told them something, or if a studio executive told them something, or maybe even if, a survey told them something. So we're kind of, I guess we're kind of investing in, creating a content system that has a variety of inputs that are, I guess, as we think of it, slightly more collaborative than, the more individualized approach of creating content.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. I think that really speaks to the ways in which, we seek across the industry, we seek signals and we seek data to ingest and either use that data to create test environments where we can run experiments that inform how we refine and move our businesses forward, or we have conviction ultimately that we need to move in a particular direction. So I think each of you guys kind of spoke to that and how we place our bets and where we, decide to spend our dollars to try to ultimately not only deliver to partners, talent, audiences, but ultimately, our businesses as they scale. So I think that was a really interesting conversation. I think I'll ask a tricky question, but one that I think might be interesting to round out with before we move into Q&A, where I see there are a couple of interesting questions as well. But the question I would like to ask this panel is, what data do you wish you had more accessibly to improve your efficiency?
I mean, I can start. I mean, I don't know how this would be pulled off, but it kind of goes back to that iterative feedback loop. If there were a way that, even as a script is getting written, if we could kind of almost get real-time feedback on how people are reacting to whether certain dialogue fits or seems authentic to them, whether certain characters or jokes are landing for them. That's the part of the content creation funnel that, is a little bit segmented right now. It goes through stages because, you don't necessarily want to overwhelm a filmmaker with too much feedback, because it might restrict them from kind of delivering on the vision that they have in mind. But I still think from a data and information, set, that would just be, completely fascinating to have as signals.
Chris, I knew you were out there. Sorry, I was just going to say,
funny enough, actually,
I know you're out there building this stuff, so I'm sure you have a point of view.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Actually, recently we've become very involved in the name, image, and likeness space of college athletes. As of July 1st, college athletes can now get paid just like professional athletes to market products, which is a, probably $10 billion or $10 million difference for us this year as our company, and could be $20-30 million next year. And one of the platforms had asked us, how do you find an athlete that's not elite at sports, but is elite at influencing? And I was stumped in that moment. So I'm just sharing something that's very top of mind with me right now. I think we'll have to figure out a way to build that. But there wasn't like an obvious answer to that. And so I kind of was speaking with my team about it yesterday and tasking them with, how do we come back to, tracking that? And I think it's always necessity is the mother of invention. When you come up upon something and you don't have the answer, that's sort of when you have to like bear down and you have to, check in with the R&D team and say, is this possible and how do you make it so? And then, we started, really baseline in 2013 as a company, with a very, very simplistic system, and the amount of nuance that it has now is staggering. So, I think every day we come upon questions that make us wonder, how do we do this? And then we just go out and we figure it out. So that's the one that's pressing me right now.
I mean, I'll jump in here. I'll flip it on its head a little bit, which is, we're coming from bigger companies and we're coming from, organizations with capital looking for content and creating, all kinds of things for advertisers, for brands, for distributors, for audiences. But this is the creator economy we're living in these days. And I think you're going to start to see an emphasis on products developed for them that will give these creators more and more information to be able to help them fine tune the creative that they are doing, to then move them up the value chain into other areas as more professional storytellers. And I'm excited to see how that kind of very nascent industry starts to develop, where they become more data centric and are able to optimize what they do.
Yeah, Laura, I want to leave space for you if you have anything here, but I know there's one coming your way next if you don't want to take it.
Oh, there's a question for me specifically. Oh, I'm scared slightly, but yeah, I was thinking about it. I mean, obviously there's tons of different data that nothing specifically comes to mind. Obviously, I personally would love to know more about competitors, but that's not something that's easily solvable, but that would make my life a little bit easier. But I'll take the next one.
All right. Well, fantastic answers. I think that's a really tricky one, and you guys gave great examples of real world. Those are issues and data gaps that would change fundamentally how we think about our ability to deliver to partners or to audiences. So, thank you guys for those answers. I think what I'd like to do, we only have 6 minutes left. So there's a couple of questions that are in the Q&A. I'm going to take those. And if we run out of time, I would just encourage folks, our LinkedIns are attached to this panel. And so look for us on LinkedIn. You can either reach out as a group to all of us, or you can reach out to us individually, but feel free to send anything we don't get to. So just because I see it first, Lucas, you have a question up at the top around Tableau, and your question, or I guess it should be more BI and dashboards, but the question is, curious as to Tableau dashboards, if any of the panelists find useful for content comprehension, particularly images for non-data executives in marketing, production, distribution, etc. So if I'm reading that back to our group, the way I interpret that is, how do you communicate to non-data or business intelligence professionals using something like dashboards or Tableau to create either visualization or improved comprehension of the signals that we're getting, and ultimately communicate in a way that either gets buy-in or brings clarity to a question. So I'll kick that over to Laura first, because I know, I'm sure you have plenty of experience with dashboards and BI.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge part. I mean, I'm in our Tableau dashboards every day, I would say. For me, it's mostly the dashboard or Tableau data on a day-to-day basis, right? So I have a range of dashboards that the data teams create that I utilize every day just to kind of get a perspective of where we are. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily I use Tableau specifically to communicate visions then to executives and beyond that. But I think it's the best tool we have, or I have, to kind of stay on top of the data without actually speaking to a data person for all the questions. And of course, Tableau, like our dashboards, only get me to a certain degree, and then beyond that, I would have to open the conversation. But so I think it's more this kind of the daily process that this is really helpful for. And then for executive communication or non-data executive communication, as Lucas mentions here, I think it's helpful, but it's kind of there is an additional layer usually that comes into play.
I'll say yes and yes to it as well. I mean, we use Tableau on a daily basis. We use it to communicate with executives, specifically sales staffs, graphics that they can pull from it that are helpful for them in their decks when they're talking to advertising partners is important. But I think, for me, where I hope the industry is going, and I know that companies have been working on this, is cognitive computing, crunching data and creating a narrative without a lot of human lifting. So that to me is something that I think is really exciting in our industry, and something that, applies to many industries where you're able to, walk in the morning and have a comprehensive understanding of maybe some regular things that you see all the time, but that the data has been crunched for you and then written in a way that's easily understandable.
For us, we have an extremely robust dashboard as Influential. Obviously, we're a little different industry, so I don't even play around in Tableau. But what I find typically is that marketing executives are essentially chief digital officers at this point. They are so savvy that it's rare that our dashboard goes too deep or confuses them. So I think that just speaks to the nature of the marketplace and how data-driven marketing is, period. But what I will say is, in the case that we are dealing with somebody who is less proficient in that, then we'll just extrapolate that out into a deck, and we'll build out charts and little notes that kind of speak to the efficacy of things. And between those two, we rarely have any loss in translation. And I think that marketers are just that savvy these days.
Yeah, we probably sit in a little bit different, where oftentimes those inputs or dashboards or things that might come from a distributor's marketing team, sometimes it's the delicate balance for us of communicating that back to the filmmakers, and we're trying to at that point kind of parse out what are the insights and the takeaways that come from that data, to try to translate that into something that a filmmaker can act on, or sometimes they might choose not to act on it, depending on what their creative vision is. So it's an area where we try to communicate all the insights that we have, and then sometimes it's a back and forth conversation between the studio, ourselves, and the filmmakers to figure out which things to act on or not.
Yeah. Well, thank you, guys. I'm conscious of time. It's 1 minute. I don't know if we're just going to automatically get shut off, but I want to thank everyone who came to join. I especially want to thank Laura, Eric, Chris, Michael. You guys have been amazing. Obviously, a wealth of knowledge. audience members, please feel free to reach out to any of us if you want to network, have questions. We're happy to communicate and also do so as a group if that's helpful for you. So just want to thank you guys and really appreciated all of the interaction and all the wisdom that came from our panel. So thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone give it up for Alex. He was awesome.
Woo!
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye.